Good afternoon. I am Liz Nick of the League of Women Voters of Boulder County. It is a pleasure to be here with you today to thank you for joining with the League in our joint effort to provide citizens with nonpartisan factual information regarding the ballot issue which Colorado voters will find on the November election ballot. Since 1936, the League of Women Voters of Colorado have published explanations and pro and con arguments on each of the ballot issues in every statewide election. It needs to be understood that the pro and con arguments published in the pamphlet by the League are not the opinions or endorsements of the League. Rather, they are arguments from the individuals and groups that support or oppose each issue. We encourage you to study these opinions before casting your ballot. Further detail on the ballot measures can be found in the Legislative Council's analysis, commonly referred to as the Blue Book, which is mailed to all active registered voters. Since 1910, Colorado voters have been able to put proposed statutory and constitutional challenges on the ballot by petition. These are known as initiatives. Amendment 66 is an initiative. Roughly half of the states have similar petition procedures, although details differ from state to state. At present, for a proposed ballot measure to make the ballot by petition, the signature requirement is 5% of the total votes cast in the last election for Secretary of State. For this year's ballot, petitioners needed 86,105 signatures of registered Colorado voters. Proponents of Amendment 66 turned in over 160,000 signatures. Today, we have been asked to discuss Amendment 66. And so we're going to do it in two parts. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization in that we do not support or oppose any political candidate or political party. However, we do study issues and take positions on those issues. And so we have taken a position on Amendment 66. So today, I'm going to do the first part of telling you about or discussing Amendment 66. And Kathy Felkner, another League member, will discuss why the League has taken a position on Amendment 66. Amendment 66 is a citizens' initiative. The proposal would amend the state statutes and the state constitution to change how preschool through 12 public education is funded in Colorado. The proposal would increase taxes to pay for educational reforms, change how funding is distributed to local school districts, require that a fixed percentage of revenue from specific taxes be set aside for education. The title, Funding for Public Schools. The major provisions are two constitutional provisions. It repeals the requirement in the Colorado Constitution that the statewide base per pupil funding for preschool through 12 public education grow annually by at least the rate of inflation. That's what we have now, so it would repeal that requirement. It would then require a minimum of 43% of state sales, excise, and income tax revenue currently collected at a rate of 4.63% continue to be collected and used for public education. So currently, we do have funding for public education in the state of Colorado. The average has been 46% that comes from these taxes. This proposal would require a minimum of 43%. Last year, it was only 40%. And this would be the state education fund. There is also a statutory provision it would increase individual income taxes from 4.63% to 5% on federal taxable income. All of you know that there's a difference between gross income and taxable income. Gross income is all your income, and then you deduct your deductions and exemptions, and that is your taxable income tax rate. So this would be income tax rates on your federal taxable income up to and including $75,000, and 4.63% to 5.9%, 90% on your federal taxable income over $75,000. This new revenue would be placed in a state educational achievement fund. Currently, funding for preschool through 12 public education is determined by a single-day student count. A bill passed by the legislature mandates that the student count will use an average daily membership method rather than a single-day count. The proposal will attempt to improve equity throughout the state by considering a local district's ability to fund schools through property tax revenues. It will also take into consideration the needs of special populations in each district, such as English language learners, at-risk students, and those with disabilities. I have not mentioned all of them here. During the 2013 legislative session, Senate Bill 213, the New School Finance Act, was passed to address the funding of preschool through 12 public schools in Colorado. The New School Finance Act is an attempt to fully fund mandated programs for special education, whereas if this passes the income tax from this, would attempt to fully fund mandated programs for special education, gifted and talented, teacher effectiveness, and innovative reading programs. It will offer at-risk children preschool and all-day kindergarten for all students who choose to do so. The per-pupil school funding will follow the student rather than remaining with the school. Right now it stays with the school. Support for charter schools will increase. There is a mechanism for negotiation between charter schools and their districts will be established. If Amendment 66 does not pass, the New School Finance Act will not be funded, and the implementation will not go into effect. So this is basically a short review of what is in Amendment 66. We do have a pamphlet that explains a little bit more, but basically the ballot proposal is a funding mechanism for the new education reform legislation that was passed by the legislature in the last session. Currently, state law provides a base for per-pupil funding, which allows each school district to receive equal funding per student. Based on factors such as a total number of students, percentage of lower income students, and cost of living in the local community, the base funding amount can be increased. In the past few years, the recession has required funding cuts to education by the Colorado legislature. And as I mentioned at the beginning, since 2000, the average share of state tax revenue spent on preschool through 12 education was 46%. And in the last fiscal year, the amount was 40%. Any questions? Okay.
What was the basis for establishing the rate at 43%?
That's a good question. I don't know what the state legislature, pardon me? Oh, repeat the question. You said what was the basis for the 43% to keep it at that level? I think that the average was 46% over those years, and it would take care of, when we had, if you don't bring in enough state income, that it wouldn't go below that, which it has in the past. And so the 43% would keep it at that level no matter what the economy is.
But on the other hand, if the economy is good and the taxes go up, then the school funding will go up by virtue
By
of
43%.
43%.
It's always 43%. It's not a set figure. So that if the economy goes down, you would still get 43% from the state.
Of the taxes.
Right, but it's, the taxes the taxes are not just one tax.
Correct.
It's state sales, excise, income tax revenue.
Right.
That's correct.
But as we all know, taxes continue to go up far in excess of cost of living typically. Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Well, my question was, what was the basis for tying the school funding to 43% of the taxes collected? And my concern is that we all know that taxes go up much faster than cost of living, and so that means since 43% is going to be tied to the tax revenue, it's going to go up faster than cost of living. And why should school funding go up faster than cost of living?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. You would have to ask your state legislators. You know, I just don't have a question for that. So, just second part. Kathy may answer your questions a little bit of that when she gives you some more information. Right now, it's all collected at a rate of 4.63%, and that's going to continue. So they didn't...
Well, the 4.63% is just this...
Income tax,
state
right.
Income tax.
Right, it is.
In addition to that, we have property tax, excise tax...
All of that.
other thing.
Right.
Not property.
Not property. Property tax is local.
Right.
It goes to your local school district.
Property.
Right, it's not property tax. Right.
I'd like to actually hear the
Other part?
other part, and then I'll ask my questions.
Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Felkner. Kathy?
Yeah.
Thank you, Liz, for the review of what the basic amendment is. And I will be talking some regarding the League's position. For those who are not familiar with League, the League only takes positions on issues where they have actually done extensive study of that topic. And education has always been a topic of interest and support by League since it very first started. Particularly here in Colorado, there has been very extensive focus on school finance since 1968. So it's not just, gee, what's happened in the last couple of years. During that period of time, or I guess I should say at the beginning of that period in time, schools were funded totally by local money. It was your property tax, vehicle ownership tax, etc., but local sources of taxation. And in that period from early 70s through the School Finance Act that was done in '88, there came to be recognition that we really needed to look at equity. Equity is something that the League is very concerned about. When we only fund schools with local money, we have a huge disparity in the resources for school districts. We have the two largest school districts in our state, Denver and Jefferson County. Those are both over, right around or above 70,000 students. We have some districts in this state that are less than 1,000. And some of those districts are located out on the eastern plains, and among the special programs, Liz mentioned several of them, but transportation is one of the things that didn't used to be. Back when some of us were in school, we got there however our families could arrange. But starting probably about 30, 40 years ago, the state mandates that school districts provide transportation for students who live a certain distance from the school. If you're in Jefferson County, that's minor. There's several school bus locations that come out and pick up the kids for a certain area and drive them to school when their distance to school is greater than the cutoff. But if you live in a district that covers 400 or 500 square miles and your student population is less than 1,000, transportation eats up an enormous part of your budget. I'm going to come back to that, but that's an example that I think helps people see the mandates place a huge pressure on school districts. If they don't get the money from the state, and when transportation was first required, the state provided 45% of that funding. Currently, last time I checked, which was probably a couple of years ago, the state contribution to transportation costs was 15%. The school district doesn't have any other source of revenue besides what comes to them through state and federal money. Occasionally there are bake sales to raise money for some project, but that's typically not, in fact, cannot be routine school operation costs. And transportation is one of those routine costs. As I mentioned earlier, there was a major school revision of the School Finance Act in 1988. However, this act was never fully funded. And for years, the cry in the state was, good plan, let's put enough state money in it to really get it operating. That didn't occur, and as you all recall, in 1992, we passed TABOR, acronym that stands for Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. That placed major restrictions on all aspects of funding at all levels of government. And school districts is considered a level of government in terms of TABOR. So there were now restrictions on how much revenue you could take in, or restrictions on how much you could spend, and restrictions on what the increase could be from one budget year to the next. That meant, by the way, if a budget dropped in year X because of recession issues, they didn't have as much money, that became the new base. And for the following year in Y, the increase was from that new lower base, not back what it was the year prior to X. However, what was the economy like in the 90s? Things going pretty good. Lots of tax revenue coming in. And built into TABOR was the requirement that if the state took in more money than was allowed by the TABOR restriction, they had to send out refunds to everybody proportionately to what they had paid, not an equal amount, but a proportion of what you had paid. Fortunately, that excused, they would not need to refund anything less than $1. But there were checks going out to people for $1.57, $2.05, etc. Very economically unsound procedure. It cost the state more to do those refunds than the people were even getting back. Thus, in the late 90s, the legislature and governor made the decision to cut the rate of income tax. So I'd like to make it clear that when we talk about going up to 5%, 5% is what our income tax had been for years and years. Sometime in, I believe probably that was in the 70s that decision was made. Used to be a progressive before that, and at about somewhere in the 70s, it went to a flat rate of 5% for all income for everybody. So in order to avoid sending out these ridiculous small refund checks that happened 2 years, they lowered the income tax rate twice. And the combination of those two reductions dropped the income tax for individuals to 4.63%. So that's what we're talking about, is the current tax rate. As you can imagine, I already indicated the school finance bill passed in '88 was never fully funded, then came Tabor. No way to increase it to what it was supposed to be. It has to go from what it is. There was a movement in the late 90s, and a group got a citizens' initiative onto the ballot in the fall of 2000. And in that initiative, which became Amendment 23, was passed, that intended to increase funding for all aspects of education. And when I say that, I'm thinking of two major categories. One is the basic per pupil funding, and the other is all of those additional kinds of programs that schools either choose to do or more often are mandated to do. English as a second language, low-income programs, special education programs, and as I indicated, transportation. Transportation is viewed as one of the special mandated programs. So with actually at that point, a decrease in state funding because revenue, the tax rate had gone from 5% down to 4.63. As we started this new century, the funding for education percentage of the budget was well down in the 30s, somewhere in the 34-35% of the budget. So everyone was looking to Amendment 23, which now required the amount spent on education needed to increase by the rate of inflation plus, for 10 years, plus 1%. That 10-year period was viewed as a time to help recover, to kind of get out of the hole, if you will, that had been created in the 90s. And everyone read it and assumed it implied to basic per pupil funding as well as those additional mandated programs. But with an inadequate amount of funds coming into the state, in fact, a question asked earlier about taxes are always going up. There may be some truth about that in the national sense, but for Colorado, taxes cannot go up at the state level or the local level or the school district level without approval of the voters. So there's never any tax, just the board decides we're going, and that's the way it is in other states. The state school board decides we need more funding, they just say we're raising the mill levy. But here, we have to have a vote of the people. And there has been no vote on increasing state income tax that has passed since Tabor went into effect. So the state income tax has never increased. In fact, it decreased the 2 times in the late 90s. So with inadequate revenue, basically what happens down at the legislature is they're arguing who gets what size piece of pie out of a smaller and smaller pie. It is not smaller in the sense of here's the total revenue that the state is spending, or here's the total budget that the state is spending, but it is not keeping up with the increase in population nor the increase in inflation, although I must say there were 2 years that were an exception because we had inflation rates so low once the recession started in the say around 2003, 2004 kind of time, very low inflation rate. We had a 0 one year and we had a minus 0.4 one year. So Amendment 23 didn't help. If they hadn't had the 1% in there wouldn't have been any kind of increase at all. So it would have said, you have to do the same job with more kids and less money. Colorado's got a pretty good education system, but they're not that good. They can't do magic. The reason, I'm going to go to another question that was asked, how did they decide on the 43%? Well, they took, as Liz indicated, they looked at what has it been since 2000 and averaged that, and it comes out to be a 46, averaged those percentages. And they came out to be average is 46. 46 sounded kind of high. So they decided, let's go more in the lower part of that. As I indicated, there were a couple of years that it was down in the 30s. But last year, as Liz said, was 40%, and they thought if we were somewhere in between that low point and the average, this might actually catch hold and there'd be enough citizens understanding the plight of education and willing to make this change. So the big change is basically taking the key elements of Amendment 23 out of the Constitution. So there will no longer be a requirement to increase by the rate of inflation, but instead there will be a minimum 43% of the state revenue for those three taxes. There's other kinds of revenue that the state gets, but for those three taxes, income tax, sales tax, and excise tax, the minimum amount that is collected at the current rate of 4.63% goes into a fund, and that amount that goes into that state education fund, as Liz said, is 43% of that revenue. The new money, what happens, and lots of people ask this question because there are folks really concerned about the fact that we thought we had the funding situation solved with Amendment 23, and it didn't work. So the new funding, that difference between paying 4.63% and 5% for most of us, any income, taxable income, $75,000 or less, would be the difference between 4.63% and that 5%. And for those incomes where they are greater, their taxable income is greater than 75, the difference for them also between the current rate of 4.63% and that 5.9. Keep in mind, that's only paid on the amount of income that exceeds the $75,000 cutoff for taxable income. You have heard on TV, I'm sure, there are some very reputable people saying, gee, that's a 27% increase? And first thought was, well, how in the world are they calculating that? That sounds like some fuzzy math going here. The only way you come up with that figure is if you say the current rate is 4.63 and the future rate is 5.9 for everybody, for everything. That difference between 4.63 and 5.9% is a 27% increase. But for most of us, that increase is going to be about 8%. So a family at a median income in Colorado last year, $57,000 of taxable income, they will pay $133 more in taxes for their 8% increase will come to that amount. Of course, if you're making more money than 57, it's going to be something higher than that. But a good way to get a handle on what we're talking about is $133 for the median income family. The money did that answer your question about how they came up with the 43?
Well, it answered my question, but I don't understand the justification. Why should it be 43% of a tax revenue when your education expense has no relation to tax revenue?
With this possibility, the question he asked is why should that go up when the tax revenue goes up, and tax revenue is not a direct relationship to education expense. Indirectly, the way that tax revenue goes up is we have more population paying into the taxes. If we have more population, we have more kids in school. We're not now talking about, as some of the requirements before, the rate of inflation, the percent of increase in student population. We're just saying, okay, here's the pie. What's a sort of reasonable cut for education? And not all of the state income, but just the income that comes from those three taxes. Let's set a minimum at 43, and we'll get a lot more work done at the State House when we're not quibbling about are we going to cut transportation? Are we going to fund transportation this year or not? 43 is going to go in there. But let me shift to also explain what happens to that amount of income that is generated by the increase in the tax rate. Because I have received, I know a lot of public has had the questions about how are they going to keep that straight? How do we know that that will just go to education? This is what they've built into the new School Finance Act that Liz referred to, Senate Bill 213, passed last spring, does not go into effect unless Amendment 66 passes, because in order to do it, you have to have this revenue. They're going to set up a separate fund, not the one that already exists, where the 43% will go, but a separate fund. As Liz said, it's called State Education Achievement Fund, and the increase revenue that comes into the state as a result of the tax increase will go into that fund. That is the built-in mechanism. The state treasurer's office has to keep track of how much goes in there and how much goes out of there and for what purposes. So we won't know for sure until the tax year of 2015 how much was actually collected for the taxable year 2014. So it's going to be a little while before we have confirmation that this estimate of about 9.5 million is what they expect to be generated. Is that clear?
950 million?
I'm sorry. I meant to say, yes, 950 million. Thank you. Good catch. Thank you very much. 950 million. So that 950 million is going to be used, at least in the near future, when it passes, when it goes into effect in the coming years. That's going to be used to get those districts that have been caught in this huge discrepancy of their funding out of the hole. So that money will be going primarily to those special programs and to transportation, hopefully reaching a point where 100% for that small district on the Eastern Plains that has to pick up 600 kids to get to school, but travels 400 square miles in order to do that. hopefully they get reimbursed for that transportation. If not, it is going to continue to be a drain on the school district budget. And some of you may have seen the commercial on TV where the very nice middle-class lady says, I've read the entire amendment and in the Senate bill, and there is nothing in there for my kids. They're not going to benefit from this. Think for a minute the implications of what we've been talking about. If a district has to pay the transportation costs out of the revenue that they get on their per pupil funding, that means there's less money for the regular education classroom. If they have to pay for a special teacher to teach English as a second language and have a class size that's much smaller, where does that money come from? If that's not funded, it comes out of what's been budgeted for regular education classroom. On and on, and anything you can choose. And those of you who may be interested in gifted education, that is one of the special programs, and that has not received, some years none, some years minimal state funding any time in the past decade. So we'd like to have special education programs. We think it's a good idea to do that. We think it's a good idea to have English as a second language. We think it's a good idea to have gifted and talented programs. But the school district can't operate those programs unless they get some money over and above what is funding the regular classroom program. I think that and I'm trying to reflect on some other questions that have come up. We've dealt with, there's the one where the gentleman says every year they're back increasing our taxes for education. I think we kind of answered that one. There has not been any state income tax increase since TABLE went into effect in 1992, and in fact there have been 2 decreases. So we're hoping that we can go back to a 5% level for, and probably 70%, right around that, somewhere 68 to 70% of the taxpayers will be in that category. They will have taxable incomes less than $75,000. The remaining 30% will be paying higher. But just reflect your thinking to yourself, what kind of income would you have to have in order to meet what has been claimed on TV as a 27% increase in their income tax payment? Your taxable income would have to be $1.4 million in order for you to pay an increase of 27% from your current payment. So, as I said, when they came up with that 27, we looked at several options of how could this have been figured out. The only one we came up with is that's the difference between 4.63% and the 5.9%, which would be the highest rate only on the portion of the income above $75,000. So that's why it would take such a huge income to make a change in a person's tax payment of 27%. I think, are there any questions that you would like to ask? Yes.
Yes, would you address the comment I've heard from some that some of this increased revenue would go to fund past pension liability rather than going to the classroom?
Yes. Past pension liability does not apply to the education field. Education, the districts paying their staff, every year that they make a payment, they are required to pay into PERA, Public Employees Retirement Association. And when school districts pay into that fund, that payment is split between the employee and the employer. Different from a lot of business situations where the entire amount of retirement funding comes from the employer. But in this situation, yes, there will be more money going into PERA because there will be more teachers hired. There will be more principals hired. There will be more aides hired. And every time you pay a salary, you pay the current existing required percentage into PERA. So there are some places, and certainly this has happened a lot in the private business world, where they delayed payments into pension funds. But in education, I don't believe that has happened. If it has happened, I'm totally unaware of it, and it's some unpublicized thing that is not well known. Yes.
Well, I think that it's well known that a lot of districts, their retirement programs are grossly underfunded. And I think that's the concern that this lady is raising here.
Right.
And there was some comment in some analysts who looked into how this funding is going to be allocated. And since a portion is always allocated to general funding within a school district, it's not inconceivable that some of those funds will be applied to para because they're underfunded. I think that is the basis for her concern, and frankly mine as well.
Right, and you actually you included another wrinkle there. It is true, not the school district situation, but PARA's situation. PARA has anticipated a growth rate would continue at 8%, which is what they were getting early, say 15 years ago, something like that. That is not the case, and they're going to have to deal with that reality. But literally, for a school district, there isn't a way, there would have to be something new passed to require some kind of additional payment, because as it stands right now, the only thing they can pay in is the percentage of a salary. And again, whatever the required PER payment is, that's split between the school district and the employee, be it principal, teacher, aide, whatever. Other elements, like we've heard things nationally about a police fund in state X, Y, or Z, their pension fund having been eroded, or even commercial operations, car companies where the pension fund is not adequate to continue and such. So I'm not saying that doesn't ever happen. And I'm also not saying that PERA is currently solvent and will be clear and free for the foreseeable future. But in terms of what the money we put into a school district resolving that, it can only happen as the percentage of their salary. And that's current salary, not going back to any past issues. So, any other question anyone wants to raise?
Yes, I'm a strong supporter of university education, public universities like the University of Colorado. And of course, the funding from the state to the university has declined substantially.
Almost disappeared.
It's, I believe, we're the worst of 50 states, and it's somewhere at a level around 5%, maybe even 4% now of the operating revenue of the university actually comes from the state. If we improve the funding for K through 12, how does this then translate into helping the university situation?
Well, one way in which it will help is it should alleviate the problem of the number of kids who finish high school and go to college with deficit skills. So if we had more money, there are all kinds of programs related to dropouts. That's another special program, by the way, a dropout prevention or seeking and counseling dropouts to return to school. But if we do a better job with educating the kids in the high schools, and some right now do a terrific job, but there are a lot of kids who come out of high school not ready for the rigorous work of college. If we can improve what's happening at the high school with special programs for those kids, we don't need the remedial programs at the college then. So there is a help in that sense. It is a concern. There are lots of cooperative programs. Colorado is kind of on a cutting edge. We have several programs in our local district and most of the districts that I'm aware of where kids can take classes at high schools that get college credit. If they take a full year of coursework as a high school student and receive the college credit for that, they only have 3 years in college. That's going to reduce the cost of what we need to cover costs for educating Colorado students. And there's also the aspect of teacher training in the colleges. The better we can make the teacher training, the better the teachers are that come into the classrooms. And nothing, any research you want to look at, stack it up year after year after year, nothing impacts the quality of education as much as a highly skillful teacher in a classroom. The other piece of research that I think I should mention here is that in the last 15 to 20 years, research after research has indicated the more we emphasize early education, number one, the more likely kids are to stay in school, and number two, the more likely they are to succeed in school. When we have kids coming from low-income families into first grade, 1 or 2 years behind where their peers are, never having, quote, read a book. By that I mean understanding how a book works, know how do you turn the pages, what's up, where's the title, what's the author mean, et cetera, et cetera. Most middle-class kids come into school already knowing that. We can't possibly expect a kid who has never handled a book come into first grade 1 to 2 years behind and expect him to meet third grade standards by the time he's in third grade. The research shows if you invest in that education early, so 20 years ago, Colorado was just barely starting a preschool program. It started in the middle 90s. Bee Romer, who was the wife of the governor at that point, was the initiator of that. And over time, it was supposed to gradually add more and more kids. Well, when we got into the early 2000s and the recession began, there was no money to add more preschool positions. So that's why you see a lot of mention about preschool in this. It's like a whole new special program, if you will. But those kids will now be counted as part of the school population. And there are numerous schools which have built additions onto their school building in order to accommodate the requirements for what does a quality preschool look like, and hiring preschool teachers, not daycare, preschool. So those kids, I believe it was in the Bush administration, and I mean the first Bush administration, so I'm talking about back in the late 80s, the national goal was to have every kid ready to start first grade. And folks, we haven't met that goal yet. And if we moved Colorado closer to that, it is a huge accomplishment for the state, for business looking for a workforce, for higher education, looking for quality students, and for those kids. We could do it. So it's going to be a big step, but it's a different way of approaching this, and the League of Women Voters would encourage everyone to consider this might be a solution to the problem we've been dealing with for 20-some years. Thank you.